Hi guys, Sam here. Welcome to my first rating video where I'll be discussing Clair Obscur Expedition 33, which I played on PlayStation 5. This was perhaps the game that I was most looking forward to playing in 2025. It looked unique, beautiful, and like something that I hadn't really played before, so I was excited. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion because I have a lot of thoughts about this one. For me, it's a game with a split personality because there are parts that I really love, but also others that were a big disappointment. In fact, it took me quite a while just to process how I felt because, well, it's complicated. There's a lot to unpack, so let's get into it. But first, how do I rate games exactly? Well, I came up with 6 elements that make games enjoyable for me: world, story, gameplay, technical, visual, and sound. I then gave each of these elements a number of subcategories, which I rate out of 10 to get a score for each element, which then gives an overall score for the game based on the weighting of each of these elements. If you'd like a longer description of what these subcategories and the scores mean, I'll link my explanation video in the description. Now be warned, this video will contain spoilers because I'll be talking in depth about the story. So don't watch this if you haven't played and you don't want the game spoiled. A spoiler-free version will come sometime in the future. The first element that I want to talk about is the world. And first up in the world is the world building, which gets an 8.5 out of 10. World building is made up of 2 elements: the physical world that we play in and the social world which we experience. So first, the physical world building. The levels are individually spectacular, and taken together they're really special. You have the feeling from start to finish that you're in some sort of fantasy, dreamlike world, which you are. And even though all of the levels are somewhat disjointed thematically, this really works in creating the vibe of a creative wonderland, and it maintains a feeling of curiosity and, well, wonder from start to finish. I also really liked how the inside of the monolith was made up of mini versions of all the main areas. It felt like going on a sort of tour of reminiscing before fighting the painters at the end of Act 2. Then there's the social world building. And this isn't really the kind of game where that's going to be such a focus, you know? This isn't an immersive open world. It's much more linear with a focus on emotion and the characters rather than creating in-depth lore. We spend maybe the opening half hour, depending on how long you take at the start in Lumiere, where the society is briefly introduced. But otherwise, the lore is entirely based around the fracture, the expeditions, and their sacrifice. And the game doesn't really need much more than that. Then moving on to the detail, which I'm giving 7.5 out of 10. Here I look at the amount of details in the game, both physical and social, that make the world seem lived in or alive. There are some cool things that I noticed, some nice little examples of things that I really enjoy to see in games. You know, when you go up to the piano in the manor, for example, the game music will actually pause for a bit and it will play a tune when you hit the keys. There are also plenty of little details scattered everywhere in the world, a lot of little bits and pieces of things that have landed all over the place that makes the world feel full of stuff as though something's going on there, you know? The Gestural Village was an absolute highlight. I really like that you can speak to everyone there. And again, there are just a lot of things laying around and going on that give it a sense of life and fullness. It was probably my favorite place in the game, to be honest. Then when I went back to Lumiere, I'm not sure if this was there at the start, I didn't notice, but I really like that there are different newspaper cutouts and posters about the expeditions and the painters stuck to the buildings. Also, the painting of Gustave and Sophie on the ceiling of the opera house was a really nice touch. I loved that there's an explanation for the handholds that are everywhere. I mean, usually they kind of just exist in games and you have to just accept that they're somehow there, even when it doesn't always make sense. But there's literally a journal entry about the expedition that built them all, shout out to them, which helped to give me a sense of all the work that the other expeditions have done to get me to that point of the journey. One area where there was a lack of detail was physical interaction with the environment, such as walking through grass or foliage. The characters just kind of go straight through these things without there being any physical interaction, you know, grass being bent to the side or whatever. And it's the same when they walk through water. There's no ripples or anything, which, it's not the end of the world, but I always like to see it. And then moving on to the world logic, where Expedition 33 gets a 5 out of 10. This subcategory is about whether the game has its own rhythms, cycles, or rules that make it feel like a self-sustaining, independent place. And it's hard to judge this game for what makes it seem realistic because it's a different reality and the beings within it have different needs, different characteristics. For example, the Gestrals don't sleep, and the whole place just works and behaves differently. But even then, the NPCs that you do find throughout the world don't move around or seem to really do anything except stand in one place and provide either dialogue or a fight or something to buy. And that in that way, the game gives the feeling of having these sets or scenes that you make your way through, rather than it actually being a place that's alive. Now, as a design choice, that's perfectly legitimate, but it does mean that the created world doesn't seem as alive as it otherwise could have. Next up is the atmosphere and immersion, which I'm giving 7 out of 10. Here I look at how the world sucks me in with its combination of graphics, ambient sound, and light. Graphically, this game is mesmerizing. It's one of the most artistically impressive games that I've looked at, and the creativity enthralled me completely. But there's more to the atmosphere of a place than just its good looks. There's also the lighting and the sound. And there was a choice to have music accompanying you throughout the entire game at the cost of these ambient environmental sounds. All games have background music, but in Expedition 33, it's obviously what you're meant to hear the entire time. And while this really conveys the artistry of everything, it comes at the cost of these places sounding alive or having any sort of ambience. Now, this isn't meant to be a criticism. The soundtrack of the game is phenomenal, and I was more than happy to enjoy it the entire time. It's just an observation of the consequence that comes with this design choice. The lighting just also wasn't really that good, which meant that the atmosphere of many of the places didn't reach the heights that it could have. I think this was due to the fact that I was playing on PS5, as I saw videos of the PC version on YouTube and it looked fantastic. Next is the environmental storytelling, which also gets a 7.5 out of 10. This is about how the world itself contributes to the story and its background. The game does this well. Environmental storytelling mainly occurs through journal entries, some of which are really great, particularly Expedition 60. They tell you the stories of some of the previous expeditions and the challenges that they've faced, and this provides context to your journey and gives you the feeling that you're really carrying on the work of previous generations. There's also death everywhere. You can see from the corpses piled up how the other expeditions ended and the sacrifice that they made for those who come after. Then you have the wondrous design of the world itself and the physics that all feel fantastical and surreal, which combined gives you a feeling the entire time that something isn't quite right here, that there's something a bit strange about where you are. For me, this contributed to the feeling of mystery that I had for most of the time playing this game, and it kind of left a question mark in the back of my mind about what's really going on here. Lastly comes the exploration, which I'm giving 8.5 out of 10. The main incentive for exploration in Expedition 33 is simple. It's full of unpredictable beauty. I wanted to visit every single location simply to see what was hidden there and to experience more of the art that the game has to offer. This was helped by the fact that there was always something to discover, whether it's a fight, a music record, or just a really cool place. The variety is key here, as the difference between all the areas is what creates this curiosity to visit them all. Unfortunately, the exploration in Act 3 was somewhat limited due to me not being able to visit many of the places, but I'll open that can of worms in another section. That gives us an overall rating for the world of Expedition 33 of 7.43 out of 10. This is an incredibly beautiful place, but the immersion within it is often let down by the fact that it feels more like a painting to look at than a real place, which you could obviously argue is the point, if it weren't for the fact that every creature and person that you meet talks about the normal life that they have or had before the fracture. Next, I want to talk about the sound, and first I'll talk about the score. The soundtrack, which gets a 9.5 out of 10. The soundtrack is simply magnificent from start to finish. What makes it so good is not only the quality, but also the incredible variety of the music. You know, from classical to almost techno and varying depending on what you're doing and where you are. A great example is Floating Waters, where the music has a very under the sea vibe. Also, the music at the Gestural Beach was just sick. Like, it just fits the vibe. Now, although there was such a broad range of music, the game does manage to maintain a clear identity, which is very impressive. And honestly, it's very brave to create a soundtrack like this due to the risk of parts sounding disjointed or just completely out of place. So why doesn't it get a 10? Well, honestly, it just didn't grab me emotionally the same way that games such as The Witcher, God of War, or even Ghost of Tsushima did. Whenever I hear the music from those games, it gets an emotional response from me. I can see scenes before my eyes and recall the emotions that those games made me feel. But Expedition 33 just doesn't do that for me. I'll come to the story soon, but its big moments just didn't get me the same way as these other games, meaning that the accompanying music just doesn't trigger the same emotional recall. And at the end of the day, a big part of music is to cause exactly these types of emotional responses. Next, I'll talk about the environmental sounds, which get a 6 out of 10. Environmental sounds are important for creating an ambience and atmosphere within an area, and they're very subtle in Expedition 33. The music is obviously meant to be the star of the show, which is absolutely fine given its quality, but this does mean that there isn't a lot of room for other sounds. The most common are the sigh of the wind and the murmur of the water, and they're effective in giving some places a sense of height or depth, whilst allowing the music to stay front and center. All in all, they're good enough to do their job, but they certainly weren't the focus of the sound design. Up next is the voice acting, which gets an 8 out of 10. Good voice acting is important for bringing characters to life and conveying their personalities. I thought all the voices were really well done from start to finish, but I was never blown away, and I think this is due largely to the fact that there just aren't many long dialogue scenes in this game which would allow the characters and their voice actors to shine a bit more. When I'm comparing games to the benchmark, I'm looking at Disco Elysium, where the voice acting really stands out. But that's also a dialogue-heavy game that gives the voice acting more space. The focus here is more on the combat, with, I would say, relatively few passages of dialogue. Perhaps with more screen time, the undoubtedly great voice actors would have had more time to shine, but that's the way it is here. So next are the sound effects, which get 9 out of 10. And these are what give various actions a layer of detail and impact. Expedition 33's sound effects are very detailed. For example, you can hear the creaking of Mael's boots as she walks. And not only are they detailed, but they're also precise and convey a sense of depth and impact when necessary. Gradient attacks sound boomingly powerful. Ciel's card attacks literally sound like she's throwing razor-edged cards at the enemy. All of the moves generally are really well highlighted by their accompanying sound, and it's this sort of detail that makes the combat feel so impactful and pleasing. The clarity and precision also come across really nicely in the floating journal entries, which give this kind of crystalline sound, if that makes sense. You know, it sounds fragile and precious. These examples show how effectively used sound effects give actions and objects a level of detail that can be descriptive and transformative. Range, precision, and depth are key, and Expedition 33 does this extremely well. The last subcategory of the element sound is the mixing, which I am giving 8 out of 10. I found the lack of 3D audio or directional sound when the characters were talking in the world a little irritating. This was probably because the characters had set lines and it wasn't guaranteed that they'd be in the current trio that was running around, but still, it stuck out to me a couple of times. Also, in White Sands, the music had dialogue which played as the characters were talking, meaning that I couldn't understand anything they said. But apart from those two relatively minor complaints, I thought the audio was well mixed. The volume levels of each element were where they needed to be, and nothing got in the way of anything else, except in White Sands. This means that sound gets an overall score of 8.2. The soundtrack really can't get enough praise. It's bold and confident, and they absolutely nailed it. So let's move on to the next core element, which is the gameplay. And first and most important is, of course, the fun, which I'm giving 8 out of 10. Expedition 33 was a very unique game for me. I haven't played that many turn-based games or any JRPGs. The closest I've come to this gameplay is Baldur's Gate 3, which is obviously very different. And from the start, I got that feeling of being addicted. I think it's to some extent the nature of turn-based games that you're always kind of like, yeah, just one more go, just a little further, just one more fight, and that makes it very addictive. The combat felt impactful and full of variety. The characters had different skills, and I was going through this very cool world with the moves to match it, fighting enemies that looked like someone's acid trip. How could that not be a good time? One of the highlights of my early game was the fight against Glaze in Harvester's Hollow. My team of the 3 girls got it pretty low after a few tries, but then all died. So in came Gustav as the last stand of Expedition 33, alone and with a lot of work before him. And when I landed the fatal strike, boy was I pumped. Like Union Berlin scoring the winning goal in the last minute kind of pumped. My fists were pumping and I was ready to go. I also really love the mini games, the parkour at the Gestural Beach, the first one where, you have to go over the water. Great. I really enjoyed it. I mean, it was a little bit frustrating with the controls sometimes. I slipped off a lot of logs. But I also don't play that many games with platforming or these kind of things in them. And it felt very old school to me. Like I was going back to games that I used to play more when I was a kid. It was something different, and I really enjoyed going from turn-based combat to having to climb an enormous tower of floating objects into the sky and screaming every time I fell back into the water. But there was no way I was going to miss out on the gestural party at the top. I mean, my FOMO just wouldn't be able to handle it. But these feelings of excitement didn't last, which is a theme that will run through the rest of this video. The last 2 gestural games that I did, the volleyball and the climbing up the wall with the water droplets, were more frustrating than fun due to controls that obviously weren't made with these kind of activities in mind. And in terms of the combat, I think this feeling started around the first fight against Renoir at the front of the manor. It was at around this point that it started to feel like a bit of a chore, and there are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, I hate it when bosses are able to completely heal themselves. You know, you spend 20 minutes learning moves and slowly getting that health bar down, only for it to go straight back up again, so that you have to do the same amount of work, having used a bunch of resources, and the moveset is basically the same. I have a similar problem with two-stage fights, but I'll leave that for the next subcategory. The point is, that's where things go from a fun challenge to a repetitive chore for me, and I start to get frustrated. But secondly, I was at a point now where I was really starting to move through the game and level up, but I noticed that I hadn't really changed many of the skills that my characters used. The patterns that I'd had from the start of the game were still effective, and whilst they felt good at times, it started to become repetitive. It became automatic for me to do the same skills with the same people according to the situation. Mael would burn the enemy, then get into virtuoso stance, and then do damage. Lune would heal and revive. Ciel would do the same combination of moves depending on whether there was one or multiple enemies. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't having a bad time, but the repetition was noticeable as these combinations remained effective for so long, even on the hardest difficulty. And this was just one of the problems caused by the difficulty, which I'll talk more on soon. This meant that the core gameplay loop ended up becoming more routine than fun towards the end of the game, unfortunately. I'll move on to the mechanics now, and here I'm giving Expedition 33 a 7.5 out of 10. First, I'm going to talk about the combat. One thing that I really loved is that each character had their own mechanics, their own combinations and powers. Mael with her stances, Lune with the stains, Ciel with the foretell, and Minoko just collecting Nevron legs for power. And I really appreciated them all being different because it kept things fresh. A small thing that I liked, which I want to mention because I'm just a simple gestural fanboy, was the Sakapatat at the start of the game when you are trying to find the gestural village. This thing was absolutely stomping me, like mercilessly taking me to Pound Town. And I was lost. I had no idea what I was meant to be doing because I was obviously at the right level to be here at this stage of the game. And then I realized that you can shoot its arms off. And I was like, huh, that's cool. It's cool that the combat goes, a little further than just selecting skills from a menu. Now, I'm personally a fan of the parrying and dodging system because it made the combat more interactive than, as I said, just picking the best skill from the menu. Pulling off parries and counterattacks felt satisfying right until the end. They felt powerful, and every time I pulled one off, I just kind of thought to myself, yeah, nah, nice try, but not today. The timing of the gradient counter didn't always make sense to me. Like, there were a couple of enemy attacks where you'd have to press the button as soon as the attack turned grey, whereas for others you'd have to wait until it was around the time where you'd normally parry or dodge. One more specific complaint that I have is about the aberrations when you go back to Lumiere at the end. If one of them lands the first strike, or you parry it, you literally can't see the second one, which just isn't cool. But overall, I'd say that the core combat systems were really great. Now, I've already touched on bosses being able to regenerate their health bars mid-fight, but here I want to talk about some other boss fight mechanics that generally annoy me. Sure, I can regenerate health during a fight, so it might sound fair that they can too, but they also have the power to one-shot my entire crew, whereas I can maybe 20-shot them. Another was Renoir being able to vanish someone. This may be perfectly legitimate somehow, but honestly, things like that just feel a little cheap to me when I'm already having to really concentrate to fight against a boss who can, as I said, one-shot me. Then there's 2-stage boss fights. I don't like them. It doesn't matter what the game is. When that health bar gets to empty, I want to know that it's over. That's how I plan my combat resources. Now, I don't care if the health bar is bigger and takes me twice as long to get through. I don't care if the boss transforms halfway through and I have to deal with a new skill set. It just feels like a cheap trick to me. It really does. And what makes it worse is when you die in the second stage and then have to start from the first all over again. And these are generally boss fights that really take some time to get through, so having to do the first stage again from the start can just feel like a real grind. It wouldn't be so bad if I got to start from the second stage with the resources that I died with, but please, have some more respect for my time than sending me back to stage 1. Yes, you can probably learn the first stage moves well enough to get through relatively unscathed, but then that starts to feel more like a chore than a fun challenge, and I do enough chores in my not free time. The other mechanic that I'll talk about is the camp. I really like the idea of a camp in a game like this. The camp in Baldur's Gate 3 was fantastic, for example. But the implementation in Expedition 33 meant that I missed out on a lot of side content. There's a key difference between the two. In Baldur's Gate 3, you have to take a long rest after you've used all your short rests if you want to replenish health and everything else. This means that you naturally go back to camp relatively often, and therefore that you interact with the various aspects of camp life, such as talking to everyone. But in Expedition 33, you can heal everyone with Chroma Elixir, which replenishes every time you rest at a flag checkpoint. Sure, you need to go back if you want to upgrade weapons or resources, but if I'm not having trouble against enemies, even on the highest difficulty, then I don't feel the need to do this, which is exactly how it was for me. So I never had a reason to go back to camp. It really only happened when I would finish a main area and the game took me back there itself. And it was only after I'd finished the game that I learned that each of the characters can have their relationship increased to level 7, and that they even give side quests, which is how Eskia gets the ability to dive. Now, the one time that I did go back to camp, outside of being forced there, I talked to Minoko just to see if any different dialogue came. But it was the same as before, so I just assumed that the new dialogue only came after completing a main area. And when I found out the truth, I was really disappointed because I'd been making a very conscious effort to do every single bit of side content that I possibly could. Before each main area, I'd make sure I'd visited every other area in that vicinity, and so in Act 3, I kind of just assumed that there was more to come after going back to Lumiere, but the game was just over, and I missed a bunch of content. So as with many aspects of the game, the core mechanics are great, but the implementation unfortunately has plenty of room for improvement. Then I'll come to the progression, where I'm giving Expedition 33 7 out of 10. Progression is made up of player progression and game progression. Firstly, I'll talk about the player progression, which looks at character development through the game. The Pictos and Lumina system is really great. Admittedly, it took me a while to realize that the Pictos also gave stats. I only concentrated on their abilities at the start and was confused that my Mael had so much health when I'd never leveled that setup. But anyway, being able to equip each Picto to only one character was smart because it means that you have to prioritize and think about how you want to build each one and shape their role within the expedition. And then unlocking them as Lumina, which can be equipped to everyone, means that you're then willing to swap them around after some time, and this keeps some freshness there because you don't necessarily have to sacrifice the effect if you've got enough Lumina points, and so you can experiment a bit more. It also means that you can get some crazy stacks at some point once you accumulate Lumina points for each character. The stack of used effects that would appear above each character after I'd counterattack towards the end was very satisfying. There are also the abilities that you can unlock with skill points as the characters level up. I thought these were okay. It's a pretty standard kind of skill tree setup where you work up to getting the most powerful skills for each player. The problem that I had with these was that I was having almost no trouble getting through the game using the skills that I had from the start, which meant that there wasn't much need to change what I'd assigned to each character. I would have happily changed them out for the sake of variety, but what I had was working pretty well. And it was the same thing with the weapons, where I rarely felt the need to level them up. So my conclusion for player progression would be that the core systems are great, but I found that they weren't implemented to their full potential. And again, that's something that's largely tied to the difficulty being too easy. A harder difficulty would have forced me to interact with these systems on a deeper level and would have allowed me to get the most out of them. And then on to the game progression, which is about the new content or incentives that the game provides over time to prevent it from becoming stale. The main thing here is obviously the different levels that become available at different stages throughout the game. Firstly, as I said, they're all unique and beautiful, which is one of the biggest reasons to visit them all. Secondly, they often have different difficulties, with many offering challenges that you can only take on later in the game. And lastly, there is quite a bit of variety in terms of their content. Some have mini games, some have music records, some are there to be explored, some have boss fights. So there's plenty to do at different stages and always something new to experience, which is great. And enabling the exploration of different areas through escape, being able to plow through lava or coral or fly was really cool. Now, where this stuttered a bit was during Act 3. I mentioned this as part of the camp mechanics, but a lot of the side content is missable if you don't increase Verso's relationships with everyone to level 7, which I didn't, despite my best intentions to experience absolutely everything that this game had to offer. There was one area that I tried to go to before heading to Lumiere to stop Renoir, but when I got there, Verso was like, "No, we shouldn't go here yet." So I was like, okay, well, I guess I'll go fight Renoir and come back here after. So I went back to Lumiere, and then, a couple of hours later, the game was over. It was only afterwards that I learned that you had to do a side quest from Mael to get access to that area. And this was really disappointing because I was making an effort every time before I went to a main area to visit every single level around it first. I would literally run or fly to every single one and complete the ones that I could and write down the ones to come back to later. And even with that mindset, I still ended up missing a bunch of things. And I think that's where the game progression didn't work very well, because it didn't guide me properly in the direction that would give me access. And I don't mean holding my hand, saying exactly what I need to do, or signposting everything. I just mean the camp mechanics not being optimal in combination with difficulty not making these camp visits more necessary and just sending me the wrong signals. Because it really wasn't my lack of trying or motivation that kept me from these areas. Then there's also the fact that Act 3 was just far too short. I'll get to that in the story section, but basically I assumed incorrectly that there would be an opportunity after Lumiere to come back to the continent. Next is freedom and decision making, which gets a 7.5 out of 10. Firstly, the different outfits are fun and offer a good opportunity to give your crew a killer vibe. From chic to playful, there's a wide variety of looks on offer to play with. And then, obviously, the Picto and Lumina system are where the game really gives you a lot of room to create different character builds and customize your playstyle. For example, my Lune was a very tanky healer. Literally, her only job was to heal and revive Mael and CL. Mael was my main attacker for most of the game until CL took over that role once I unlocked the gradient attacks. And the combination of these two systems means that you can approach the game in many different ways with different character combinations, which I'll test out in my second playthrough. And that's really nice. This is also possible thanks to the skills, which can be used to create synergies between different characters and lead to the development of different combat strategies. Not to sound like a broken record, but this is again something that makes me wish that the difficulty was better calibrated, as having to really think about which characters work best together and how they can support each other would have been a really fun challenge. The story is obviously very linear with little room for decision making outside of the ending, but that's fine. Not every game needs to be a choose your own adventure RPG. All in all, the freedom that Expedition 33 offers the player is deep, but limited to the combat systems, with no room for further influence. Then there's the controls, which also get 7.5 out of 10. This isn't a very control-heavy game just due to the nature of the gameplay. The main controls are moving around, parrying, and blocking, which all work fine. Apart from that, it's mainly just selecting skills from the menu, which is simple, but it felt fluid. However, in the times where the game does require more in terms of controls, such as the gestural minigames, they really aren't great. The platforming was a particular challenge at the start where I was constantly slipping off logs despite landing in the middle, and the gestural volleyball was made much harder than it needed to be because I couldn't actually attack as quickly as the little gestural balls were flying at me. It was just very obvious that the controls weren't made for these types of activities. Lastly, in gameplay, I want to talk about the difficulty, which I'm giving 4.5 out of 10. Expedition 33 is too easy, even on expert. Don't get me wrong, sometimes it would take me a while to beat bosses, but I was getting through all the main areas without too many problems. The one time that I really struggled was the first fight against Renoir. Now, things being a little too easy might not sound like such a big problem, but the knock-on effects are. As I've said, a higher difficulty would have made it more necessary for me to go back to camp to level up my weapons and resources, and would have ultimately led to me having more conversations with everyone and likely not missing all the side content that I did. I would have put more thought into which attributes I upgrade for everyone. I did at the start, but by the middle to the end, I was just on autopilot, upgrading the same stats for the same characters every time. Compare this to Elden Ring, where investing every skill point is a nerve-wracking decision that requires some serious deliberation. I would have thought deeper about Pictors and Lumina to make sure that I was really getting every little bit out of them that I could. I would have considered the scaling bonuses of the weapons instead of just concentrating on their damage stat. I would have thought more about the composition of my party and how different character skills could complement each other. Difficulty being too easy means that I wasn't forced to interact with the game mechanics as deeply, which is a real shame because Expedition 33 has some great depth in its systems. On top of this, there was a lot of unevenness in the difficulty between the side content and the main areas. The main areas should really be your compass in terms of where you're at with progression. If you can't get past someone, then you probably need to go back and do some side stuff. And if you're managing, then you're probably fine. So when I'd get through main areas with no big problems, I assumed I was about where I needed to be. I'd then do as much side content as I could, getting through the areas that seemed to be made for my level and leaving the ones that were far too difficult for later, because obviously I was going to need some more time and some more XP to get there. But there was a big problem with this in Act 3 after I fought the Paintress. This was obviously the biggest boss fight of the game at that point, and I only died once, which suggested to me that I was at about the level where I needed to be. That's the signal that the game was giving me. Then Act 3 starts, and before I go back to Lumiere, I want to visit as many of the unvisited levels that I can and take on some of the fights that had already been crushed in and that I'd written down to visit later. So I went back to the painting workshop to face the beast, and I got stomped without doing any damage, really. So I went to test Sprung again, and, well, I may as well have been hitting it with pillows for all the damage that I was doing. Useless. So I thought to myself, okay, I'm obviously nowhere near strong enough yet, so that must come later, given that I just beat the Paintress in my second attempt. I also couldn't dive with Esquier, so the obvious conclusion for me at that point was that there's more to come later. So I head to Lumiere, fight Renoir, and the game's over. which was really disappointing. And this shows the problem. Defeating a main boss easily, but then having exponentially harder side content available signaled to me that there's more to come. That was the only way that I could explain this discrepancy to myself, and I think that's a weakness of the game, as it can very easily lead to situations like mine where you just assume there's more to come and then end up missing a bunch of content that you really would have liked to complete. So the issue isn't just that the game's too easy, it's that the difficulty actively undermines several of its core systems and therefore the overall experience. So all of this means that Expedition 33 gets a score of 7.08 for its gameplay. Whilst that's a good score, it does feel disappointing because of the wasted potential. There are cool systems with great depth here, but the experience is ultimately dampened by a difficulty that didn't push me enough and undermined the experience overall. But I did have a good time nevertheless. Okay, now I'll come to the next element, the story. So let's get into it, starting with the main story, which I'm giving 5.5 out of 10, unfortunately. On paper, the premise of the story is uniquely fascinating. A painted world full of life created by a boy whose mother flees there to escape her grief over his death, whilst the husband tries to bring her back to reality so that she can heal. This is an opportunity to explore themes such as the nature of reality, grief, the role of art, escapism, and all of the moral and ethical questions that come with the power to create worlds. It's a combination that, in the setting of Expedition 33, has the potential to be generational. Now, I've read a lot of opinions of people for whom this story was incredibly moving and touching, and I'm really happy that people enjoyed the game this way, and I certainly don't want to take that experience away from anyone. Stories are deeply personal and subjective, and different things work for different people. But for me, the story of Expedition 33 just missed the point. Now, one of the tricky things for me to work out was my feeling of dissatisfaction and disappointment at the end of the game. Did this come only from Mael's ending, which is meant to elicit this kind of response? But no, it's not. It's much more than that. This wasn't the kind of disappointment that a good story can intentionally leave you with. Until Act 2, I thought the story was interesting enough without it ever really sucking me in. There was obviously more going on than the journey to defeat the Paintress, but there weren't really enough clues to allow me to build theories or have any idea where the story was going. It felt mostly like I was waiting for some big reveal. The problems started for me at the end of Act 2, when everyone gets gommaged after defeating the Paintress. That moment, whilst obviously sad, didn't hit me as hard as it should have, because I didn't feel a strong emotional connection to the characters, something which I'll touch on soon. The twist itself was pretty cool and delivered the big reveal that I'd been hanging out for. But then the entire game changed and became focused on the grief of the Descendre family. And the biggest problem that I had with this is that I found it hard to care, because I didn't know any of these people. Sure, we'd briefly met the painted versions of Renoir and Alicia, but we also didn't know anything about them at all, really. So the rest of the story plays out around a grieving family from a different reality and the fight of Renoir to get them back there and ensure that they can't escape to this canvas again. Now, Renoir's motive is completely understandable. Facing your grief and healing is necessary and healthy, and he cares about his family. On this level, the story still has potential, but from my point of view, it makes one fatal mistake. It made the characters within the canvas real, and this brings with it a plethora of moral issues that the narrative ultimately couldn't handle. The game tries to build narrative tension regarding the question of saving the canvas but escaping reality, or destroying the canvas and returning to Paris to heal. The tension here is, on the one hand, the characters in the canvas that we very much care about, and on the other, doing the sensible thing by facing life in Paris and healing. Again, there's real potential here. There is space here for a tragic story that forces us to make a gut-wrenching decision. But in my experience, these two sides weren't balanced enough to create the intended tension. First of all, Painted Verso has undoubtedly suffered a lot, and I understand him wanting to die, but why should I care more about this painted person's wish to die than the wishes of my painted companions to live? Why is his grief more important or more real than that of anyone else? But perhaps more importantly, why would I care more about the grief of the Descendre family than the population of the canvas? The answer that the game seems to imply is that this is because the Descendres are real, whereas the canvas is painted. But exactly this is the biggest problem with the game's story. There are two ways to understand the canvas. Firstly, the people and the creations within it aren't actually sentient life, in which case, erasing the canvas and going back to the real world to move on would seem legitimate and would perhaps be the right thing to do. But if that's true, that these creations aren't actually sentient, then the first two acts mean literally nothing and honestly are somewhat cheap and manipulating. The whole point of the first two acts of this game is that the people in the canvas matter. They've been suffering for generations, they have very real emotions and grief, and conflicts, about whether people should have children or whether that would be cruel in this world. This is what I experienced for the first 48 hours of the game. These people are fighting to exist and rebelling against the force that they think has been wiping them out for the last 67 years. We are constantly reminded of the sacrifices of the previous expeditions, whether through journal entries or the piles of corpses. So if they aren't sentient, then the first two acts were a lie, a cheap trick. It's like the twist of waking up from a dream at the end of a story. The second option is that the characters inside the canvas are sentient, which is how I understood it for the reasons I've just said about them all having very real problems and emotions. And this means that their suffering is real. The suffering of 67 Gommages is real. Everything that Esquier and Francois have felt over centuries is real. How much suffering has everyone in this canvas experienced? All of these characters that I've just spent 48 hours with, plus the ones that came before. And in that case, destroying the canvas would essentially mean causing a mass extinction. And for me, that's exactly the biggest problem. The story makes the canvas too real, which for me meant that there wasn't really any narrative tension in the final act. What was needed was something in the middle of the extremes of sentient or not. Perhaps something that at first seems it, but that we learn isn't, which can create the desired emotional impact but avoid the moral severity and therefore create better balance to the tension between destroying or saving the canvas. Or if the Descendre family were actually likable instead of pompous, entitled assholes, then perhaps I would have been more open to sympathizing with their grief. But to ask me to put their grief before the generational grief of the entire population of the canvas is simply insane. Then there's a glaring ethical problem that the game doesn't even try to address. The Descendre family literally has godlike powers to create sentient life. And that has consequences and comes with a hell of a lot of responsibility. If you're going to create intelligent life, then you need to treat it as the intelligent life that it is, that has the same feelings and ultimately rights as the creators. But this isn't touched on at all. The fact that Renoir has no problem committing mass extinction is met with some sort of pathetic, but you can't choose for them from Mael, and that's it. I'm sorry, but these psychopaths literally create life to play with and escape from their feelings, and then just wipe them out when it becomes too much? The Descendres have created all of this life, have tortured them for generations, and now want to annihilate them? Fuck the Descendres. They created this world. They need to deal with the consequences instead of just committing genocide. Now, the grief of the Descendre family could have been an effective vehicle to explore all of these issues, but framing their grief as the most important thing without questioning this framing through the characters, for example, steals a lot of potential depth from the story and leaves no room for topics such as the nature of reality. If I can essentially create another dimension, another reality, does that make it and the life within it any less real? That's a big philosophical can of worms to open, and honestly, a missed opportunity for a game that obviously wants to take on deep and mature themes. I appreciate what the story was trying to do, but in my opinion, it didn't achieve the narrative tension that it was aiming for, and it brushed past the glaring moral implications that came with it. The next subcategory in story is the storytelling, where I'm giving Expedition 33 4 out of 10. I enjoyed one thing, and that was the sense of mystery. You set out on this epic journey, but it goes south immediately when a white-haired man decimates everyone. Not long after, we get some scenes with this man and a girl that looks remarkably like Mael, and it's clear that there's more going on here. This actually does a really nice job of setting up the mystery because it adds another layer to what is otherwise a pretty straightforward and understandable goal of setting out to defeat the Paintress. And it's a good thing that there's more going on, because for me it was pretty obvious that the Paintress wasn't going to be the enemy in the end. A group of people setting out to fight an ominous evil that they don't remotely understand, that also just looks miserable, is obviously setting up to subvert your expectations. But I was just as surprised when the sun rose this morning. Anyway, the initial setup is pretty good. Clear goal with something mysterious going on underneath. But the problem that I had after a while was that the mystery was far too mysterious for far too long. It felt like there was a bit of a vacuum of information. The little bits that we did get, such as Verso being Renoir's son and Maya and Alicia having some sort of connection, didn't really get the chance to develop due to how isolated and almost cryptically they were shared. The true nature of the reality that you're in isn't really hinted at. Sure, you could think that there's something strange about this world, but fantasy worlds often have crazy things going on, so it doesn't necessarily mean much, and it would certainly be a leap to come to the conclusion that you're in a painting. This meant that instead of actively wondering where the story was going next or developing an expectation for what might happen, I was kind of just passively waiting for something. And honestly, I think this really hurt the story because there was plenty of room to develop ideas that could have paid off in Act 3. We could have learned more about the Dissandres and perhaps developed some sort of sympathy for them. There could have been hints that perhaps this world isn't real, or that the characters perhaps aren't the intelligent life that they seem, if the game wanted to go in that direction. But we don't get any crucial information until the big gommage at the end of Act 2, and by that point there's only about 2 hours of story left. So we go from 48 hours of relatively little in terms of story, to everything important in the story happening literally in the last 2 hours. This pacing is jarringly uneven and doesn't give the concepts that are introduced in Act 3 enough time to establish meaning and weight. Now, I have absolutely no problem with such a drastic change of focus as a storytelling mechanic. It could be very powerful if it's used well, but it also needs to be earned for it to land, and I don't feel that it was. The family, who are now the center of the game, are essentially strangers, and now their grief is meant to be significant. And this is grief that we only learn about through a bit of exposition, in comparison to the grief of our companions and the generations before them that we've just experienced for the last 48 hours. If this shift of focus, and therefore all of Act 3, was going to work, then the family and their issues needed to be introduced in some way much earlier so that it didn't feel like they just hijacked the story. Now, you could argue that it's intentional that the Dissandres take over in this way, and that we aren't meant to like this, that it's meant to provoke us a bit. But I think that this reframing only works in the case where the game itself kind of pushes back on it a bit and recognizes it as problematic, which would have been the perfect role for the canvas inhabitants, as there was an obvious but criminally underused argument that, hey, you don't get to just come in here like gods and decide our fate just so that you can deal with some family problems. Then we get to the end of the game, and we're meant to make a choice between staying in the canvas or destroying it. But the basis of one decision is meant to be the grief of this family that we meet a couple of hours earlier, which is asking a hell of a lot of a concept that was introduced a couple of hours ago when opposed to the lives of the characters we've spent the entire game with. The game tries to set up this massive moral conflict, but fails to do this due to the unevenness of the storytelling over the 3 acts and by not achieving the necessary balance in the opposing arguments, as I mentioned in the previous section. It's almost like the story tries to compensate the absence of the Dissandres in the first 2 acts by making them the focus of Act 3. But this appears to have the consequence that the characters of the first 2 acts are almost completely ignored in the third, as they don't really push back meaningfully against Renoir or assert their right to exist. Now, seen like this, all 3 acts appear one-sided in different ways. The first 2 in favor of the canvas, and Act 3 in favor of the Dissandres. This tension needed to be built more evenly and consistently over all 3 acts. There's one last thing that really irritated me at the end, and that was the little boy. We get to the point where it's time to make a decision about the fate of the canvas, and then the little boy appears, and it's kinda implied that if we side with Mael, we're basically torturing a little boy by forcing him to paint eternally. Now, I'm sorry, but the decision that we're meant to make here should be based on the experience of our playtime and the story until that point, not the fact that we might be torturing a little boy by siding with Mael. It feels like emotional blackmail, and honestly, it has absolutely no place there, considering, again, that it wasn't earned through any sort of setup. Going back and reading all of the lines of dialogue that the fading boy has in the game, there's extremely little to nothing there that suggests that he is unhappy painting. His unhappiness seems directed only to the destruction and conflict that has been caused by Aline and Renoir fighting in the canvas. As with the story, I can see what the game wanted to do, but for me, the desired tension wasn't built up evenly or consistently enough over all 3 acts, which led to the first 2 feeling somewhat empty at times. Next, I want to talk about the characters, which get 6 out of 10. I'll talk about the main characters first, the expedition. They're all really nice, I like them, and I was happy to spend time with them. But, honestly, I never felt a strong emotional connection to them. And the reason for this was that the deeper dialogue came predominantly during the camp scenes after you've cleared a main area. There weren't many character building scenes when you were out on the continent or going through one of the levels, and this is more than 95% of the game. Sure, there were small comments that characters would make at different places, but they were insignificant. Of the 49 hours that I played, I feel like I spent maybe an hour with the characters, which just isn't enough for an emotional connection to develop. Now, if you're going to spend such little time with the characters, then their personalities at least need to stand out and really grab you from the start. But for me, they just didn't. Gustav felt a bit one-dimensional. A really lovely guy, deeply committed to the expedition, but I found there wasn't much more to him than that. Mael is obviously a traumatized young girl who had a rough childhood and loves Gustav as a brother, but again, that's mainly all that came across. None of this cast, including Lune and Ciel, have personalities that are going to immediately steal the show. They're obviously characters that you need a bit more time to get to know, but I feel like they didn't get that time. When I'm thinking of what the best characters are that I've experienced in games, I think of Mass Effect, Baldur's Gate 3, and The Witcher. Now, if anything similar to the end of Expedition 33's Act 2, where everyone dies, had happened in those games, I can't imagine what that would have done to me emotionally. I might quit gaming. I mean, not really. But it really shows the difference that at the end of Act 2, I was like, oh, that's sad, but that it wasn't that impactful. Now compare this to the side characters of this game. Starting with the Gestrels, they're so much fun. They're cute, they're silly, they like to party, and just to mix it up, they also love to beat the shit out of each other for fun. I mean, how can you not love them? They're all just out there living their best lives, going with the flow, and doing what whatever it is that makes them happy. Then the Grandis, although not as present as the Gestrels, add a similar value by just being wonderfully refreshing in unexpected ways and providing great comic relief. I'd love to visit the Oratory game someday. And last but not least, the real MVP of this game, Esquier. I fucking love Esquier, and he is now up there with my favorite video game characters of all time. What a great character. So much fun. Dancing when Mael and Verso are playing the piano, just collecting his rocks, and then the conversation with Verso about being wee woo. He just has such a well-written and infectious personality that comes across with its voice and look perfectly.
Oh, great name. Oh, can I be Esquier the Great? No, wait. How about Esquier the Brave? Oh, no. Esquier the Great is better.
You're just a big ball of nonsense sometimes, aren't you?
That's why we're best friends.
I loved all of these side characters, even though they get less screen time and the story isn't primarily about them. And that's because they're captivating from the moment you meet them. They stand out in a way that none of the main cast do. Honestly, they deserve their own game. Now, I know I missed some of the side content with the expedition, but in my opinion, the main quest should be doing most of the heavy lifting in terms of character development anyway. Lastly, I understand why the game made the decision for you to only be able to interact with everyone as Verso, but that comes with the obvious weakness that you only experience his relationship with everyone, rather than the dynamic of the group or the various relationships within it. I remember we saw one conversation between Lune and Ciel as they were looking at the stars, but that was the only one. And as a side note to finish it off, I think the way I've approached this subcategory shows one of the biggest weaknesses of the game, which I've mentioned plenty. The Desandra family didn't even enter my mind when thinking about the characters. Next, I want to talk about the writing, which gets 7.5 out of 10. Here, I essentially look at the quality of the dialogue. My favorite part of the writing of this game were the Gestrels. Every conversation with a Gestral was an absolute delight. The silliness combined with their love for throwing down was refreshing in an otherwise gloomy game. The conversation with the swimsuit Gestral at the end of the first parkour challenge was a particular highlight, and I also really enjoyed the amount of brush-related dialogue in the Gestral village. The Grandis were a similar highlight. Their eloquence was fantastically over-exaggerated. A highlight there being the one Grandis trying to convince the other to get down from his vantage point in Monoko's station. I thought the writing was pretty great throughout the rest of the game, confident, self-aware, and it seemed to subtly make fun of cliches at various points. At least that's how I understood some parts. But it's also not the most dialogue-heavy game, so that part of it doesn't get a lot of time to shine. But then there were a couple of things that really bothered me. The first one was the way in which Lune and Ciel seemed to just kind of accept their fate at the end of the game. Lune spoke up once, but I would expect a hell of a lot more considering that, I don't know, the annihilation of their entire world is at stake. It just doesn't make sense at all considering that the entire story is about them fighting for their continued existence. Now, I chose the Mael ending, but I watched the Verso ending on YouTube afterward just to see how that went, and had a big, huh, moment. As Mael is fading away, Verso says to her, "You have this incredible power to paint. You'll never have to suffer a life you don't want." I mean, excuse me, what? Isn't this a complete contradiction to everything you're trying to achieve right now? The reason you want to destroy this world, apart from to die yourself, is that so your kind of mother and Mael can return to the real world to deal with their grief. And we've established that this family has a problem with getting stuck in their canvases. It happened to Renoir, it happened to Aline, and now you're telling Mael that if her life is that bad that she can just paint another world to escape to? You'll save Aline from this canvas but tell Mael she can just go do essentially the same thing at some point? Sure, you could argue that Mael could have had a healthy relationship with a canvas if Renoir wasn't threatening to destroy it. But is that actually plausible considering the family history? It would have been much more consistent if he'd tried to give her a message of finding happiness in your own reality. Up next are the side quests, which I'm giving 6 out of 10. The White Neverun quests were fine. They were very vague, Souls-like kind of side quests, but I didn't get the feeling that they added a lot narratively. The one that I did actually enjoy was with the White Troubadour who I had to teach not to kill. That was a fun little game and story. The Gestural Beach minigames were mostly great. The controls were a little frustrating, but otherwise I really enjoyed them. Having a change of pace, doing these little mini games with this fun music playing, and then getting fun rewards was just a good time, and the whole thing really paid into the Gestrals being just a very silly, fun-loving bunch of characters. The Eloquence battle against the Grandi's Fashionist was a great idea, but far too easy. The correct answer was always the longest and generally the first one, which took some of the fun out of it. And it's a shame because it could have been very funny. It reminded me of the kind of rap battle in The Witcher 3 Blood and Wine against Mancomb, which was absolutely hilarious. Anyway, all in all, I'd say that the side content is fine. The games are fun, but there is very little contribution narratively. Obviously, I missed a bunch of side content, so maybe all of that was better, but unfortunately, I won't experience it until my second playthrough. Lastly, I'll talk about the gameplay integration, where I look at how story and gameplay are intertwined and gameplay mechanics are leveraged for storytelling purposes. Here I'm giving Expedition 33 a 7 out of 10. There wasn't a whole lot of this, but there were some moments where it was done really well. The first was when you had to desperately fight as Gustave against Renoir just before Renoir kills him. You know it's a hopeless fight, you're doing literally no damage, and this guy is just staring at you like, lol, not impressed at all. It really gives you a sense of desperate hopelessness and shows that you just aren't on the same level, that you're up against something that is exponentially stronger. This feeling comes across much stronger from having to play out that situation rather than if it had just been shown to you in a cutscene. Another example is the fight against the Paintress after you've defeated her and she starts to heal the expedition. This is the game telling you through gameplay that she isn't actually the enemy and doesn't really mean you any harm. And you needing to actively take out an enemy that's literally on the floor and healing you is, well, uncomfortable. It doesn't feel right, and it gave me the sense that something was off. Then the last time that Expedition 33 leverages gameplay mechanics, well, is obviously when you have to choose the side of either Verso or Mael to decide the fate of the canvas. The player has to decide through the gameplay the outcome of the story. It's a classic. And not only do we have to make a decision, but we also have to defeat the other character. It was a good thing for me that Mael was almost my strongest character, whilst Verso was comfortably my weakest, because I stomped that asshole. All of this means that Expedition 33 gets a rating of 5.78 out of 10 for its story. I really wish it were better because there are parts of this game that I absolutely love. But for me, the story was deeply unsatisfying, even if I did get to meet Esquier. The next core element that I'll discuss is the technical. And first up is stability and bugs, where Expedition gets a 10 out of 10. This is going to be quick. I didn't have a single crash, and I didn't encounter a single bug throughout the entire game. From start to finish, no issues whatsoever. Easy. Then there's performance, which I'll give 9 out of 10. The game runs excellently on a PlayStation 5. The 60 FPS felt constantly smooth. The only thing I did notice was some frame rate drops in White Sands. I don't know what was up with that place. I had a couple of issues there, but the frame rate was all over the place. But apart from that, it was largely fine throughout. I had no significant problems to report. Next is polish, which gets a 7 out of 10. My main problem here was that there was quite a lot of clipping with clothing and collision issues in the world. Water would sometimes come through the rocks in the sea, like as waves were rising, the water would also rise through the rocks instead of just around them. And then there was this instance in Lumiere where some rubble flew off the side of a building and then just disappeared through the ground. Also, the lip syncing in this game is not very good.
Yes.
There must be better uses of your time than analysing our stress levels.
And there was the occasional visual glitch where some colors would kind of just flicker around inexplicably. All in all, there were just enough of these small issues for it to bother me at some point. And lastly, there's the use of hardware, where I'm giving Expedition 33 5 out of 10. I played on performance mode, and whilst the frame rate appeared to be pretty solidly at 60 FPS, the resolution left quite a bit to be desired. This game is by no means bad looking, but according to Digital Foundry, the resolution is actually less than 1080p, which is the absolute minimum that I would expect on a PlayStation 5 these days. So this gives Expedition 33 an overall score for technical of 8.4 out of 10. The last main category to talk about is visual, and first up is style and art direction. Now, what can I say? 10 out of 10. The art in this game is quite simply on another level to anything that I've experienced. Full stop. You know, there are a lot of very cool games with very cool art, but there's usually some degree of familiarity there, like a remaster of something you've seen before. But not in Expedition 33. It starts off really strong in Flying Waters, like what an introduction to a game. You know, you're in this place that looks underwater, but is it underwater? Then there's Harvester's Hollow, which, no joke, almost made me cry. The combination of yellows, blue, purple, and white literally gave me shivers. The key to the beauty of this game is the diversity of the creativity. Each level is uniquely beautiful, with vaguely familiar elements looking reimagined in a painter's acid trip. The bent Eiffel Tower and huge slabs of rock floating in the sky add to the sense of wonder and feeling that there's something just a bit off in this world. And it's not only the world design. The Nevrons and various enemies are also fantastically unique and full of character, as are the rest of the canvas's inhabitants, the Gestrels, the Grandes, and Esquier. Even the expedition's outfits are great. Leaning into the French baguette-carrying mime stereotype was quite funny. I don't know what else to say, really. The art kinda just speaks for itself. It's a joyfully eerie explosion of the wildest creativity. Next is the graphic quality, where I'll give Expedition 33 7.5 out of 10. It feels very typical UE5. Very good, but not something that's going to blow anyone away. There aren't really any problems. There's no bad quality assets or textures. It's just that everything has this sort of grainy unclarity that sometimes comes with UE5, which in this case also isn't helped by the resolution being less than 1080p. Now for the immersion and coherence, which I'm giving 8.5 out of 10. First, I'll talk about the immersion, where I look at things like lighting, repeated use of assets, anything that can make a game look too gamey in the negative sense, or anything that adds to immersion in the positive sense. This is something that Expedition 33 does really well. The lack of HUD was great. I'm a big fan of this in basically every game because I'd much rather look at the world and the art that's on my screen than be distracted by text or markers or other unnecessary HUD elements. And Expedition 33 is certainly a game where you just want to enjoy the visuals. A nice little detail is that at the end of every battle, the prompt to continue is "We continue," which pays into the language and the mission of the expedition. On the other hand, I feel like the lighting isn't great on the PlayStation 5 version. When I watched some YouTube videos of the PC version, I was actually blown away a bit by how good it looked and how significant the difference is. Having rays shine through environments, for example, can really increase the ambience, but this effect was largely lacking in my PS5 experience. Something else that broke my immersion a bit was the fact that the game just looks very UE5. Not all, but a lot of games made on that engine kinda have a similar look to them. Same kind of feel, even if they're completely different artistically. There's just something like a graininess of the lighting. I don't exactly know how to explain it, but Black Myth Wukong and Expedition 33, for example, just have a similar sort of finish to them. And the thing is, I've seen this a lot now, so it stands out quite a bit and unfortunately takes away from the immersion. Then there's the coherence, which is about how well all visual elements work together to create a coherent piece of art. This is something that Expedition 33 does excellently. Despite there being a lot of different areas with levels that are artistically very different, it all fits within the world of the canvas. Nothing feels disjointed or out of place in any way. The same applies for menus and HUD elements. They all fit the vibe and the look of the game. There's this very Art Deco or Art Nouveau, I'm not an art historian, style to it which feels very Parisian and which can be seen not only in the world but also through every button and piece of text in the menus. Literally every graphical element pays into the game's signature look. Then last of all we have the cinematography, where I'm giving Expedition 33 10 out of 10. The opening scenes with the gamage where Sophie evaporates into flower petals simply blew me away. The framing, the slowing of time, the changes in color, the strikingly imposing images of the paintress rising to paint the number 33. It's a confident statement that told me that I was in for an incredible artistic experience, and the game had me enchanted at that point. Until Expedition 33, my top game for cinematography was Ghost of Tsushima, which uses framing, lighting, and colors masterfully, but also classically. Not to take anything away from that game, but Expedition 33 goes just a bit further by feeling more daring, more bold. You know, this game is artistic to an extent that very few are, which isn't a slight against any other games in any way. But here the artistry is heavily exaggerated without becoming too much. And that applies to the cinematography as much as it does to the style and art direction. Another strong example is the scenes with Painted Renoir and Alicia, where the aspect ratio changes and the film becomes black and white. For me, this created a sense of something otherworldly, something that comes from a different place as the expedition, and it gave these two an aura of mystery and a sense of foreboding. But it's not only the cutscenes that make use of cinematography, it's also everywhere in the combat. A dynamic camera uses zoom and perspective to frame moves, counters, characters, and enemies differently and create a sense of impact and scale, which significantly elevates the sense of drama. This is then capped off by the shot when you take out an enemy and the camera freezes on your character mid-attack, in air, chroma and color flying everywhere, and framing your victory as something gloriously epic. The pervasiveness of the cinematography within the game, with its bold innovation that confidently highlights its artistry, is the reason why Expedition 33 deserves a 10. This means that Expedition 33 gets an overall score of 9.08 for visual, which is outstanding. This is unsurprising given the confident execution and coherence of its wildly creative style that sets it apart from anything I've ever seen. For me, it's the highlight of the game and the reason that I was so drawn to it in the first place. So now we come to the overall score for Expedition 33, 7.61 out of 10. Whilst this is a very good score, it feels like a disappointment for this game. My feelings towards it are comparable to my emotions regarding Game of Thrones. It was brilliant and had so much promise before starting a very strong southward trend. And that's why I say that Expedition 33 has a split personality. There's so much about it that is absolute peak. The music, the art, its daring uniqueness. After about 15 hours of playtime, I was genuinely worried that this game was going to break my rating system. I suspected that the art would get a 10, that the music could get a 10, and that the cinematography would also get a 10. I then assumed that the story would probably be up there given the quality of everything else, and I was like, what the hell am I playing right now? Like, this could blow everything out of the water. But at the same time, there is so much that was disappointing. Mainly the story, but then also the unused potential of the mechanics and the rest of the problems stemming from the difficulty. I really, really want to love this game. The music is brilliant and the visuals made me feel a way that a lot of games can't. It's simply special, but I can't love it. And that makes me sad. So thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more reviews in the future, then feel free to like and subscribe, as they say. Otherwise, I hope you have a nice day, and until next time.